Welcome to Israel Now News. I'm Yochanan El-Rom.
And I'm Rebecca Rand.
In our top story, the Israeli Mossad allegedly killed al-Qaeda's second-in-command during a daring mission in the heart of Iran. The New York Times claims that Israeli agents assassinated Abu Mohammed al-Masri on August 7th, the anniversary of the bombings that al-Masri orchestrated on the U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania. The terrorist mastermind had been living in an upscale neighborhood in Tehran, where he was planning attacks on Israeli and Jewish targets. The article stated that the mission was executed in cooperation with American intelligence organizations. Tehran has denied the reports of al-Masri's death, but Israeli news sources claim that Iranian leaders fear further joint U.S.-Israeli operations to eliminate other wanted terrorists operating from the rogue Islamic Republic.
Thousands of Israelis were sent scrambling for bomb shelters as terrorists from Gaza fired rockets into Israel. The projectiles fell in open areas along the coast, one in Ashdod and one just south of Tel Aviv on Palmachim Beach. The IDF determined that the missiles were fired from a Hamas launch pad. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu gave a stern warning to the terror groups in the coastal enclave, saying the price of continued aggression would be very high. Shortly thereafter, the IDF struck Hamas military posts and its underground infrastructure in the Gaza Strip. A spokesperson for the IDF said they will act firmly and resolutely against any attempt to carry out terror activities against the citizens of the State of Israel.
U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo landed in Israel last week on the first direct commercial flight to the Jewish state from Bahrain. The top American diplomat was in Europe and the Middle East as part of a seven-nation tour. He was joined in Israel by the Bahraini foreign minister for a high-level trilateral meeting with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Pompeo's trip to the region is seen as a step to solidify and advance the recently signed Abraham Accords, brokered by U.S. President Donald Trump, which saw 3 Muslim countries normalize ties with the Jewish state. His visit did not come without controversy. The Palestinian leadership berated the U.S. Secretary of State ahead of his arrival for plans to visit the Golan Heights and Basagot winery in Samaria.
The International Atomic Energy Agency believes Iran is stockpiling massive amounts of enriched uranium. The nuclear watchdog organization also notified world leaders that Tehran continues to enrich uranium to a higher purity than allowed by the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action Agreement, brokered by the Obama administration. This report confirms that the rogue Islamic Republic continues to advance its ominous nuclear ambitions. The Arms Control Association released its assessment that Iran has more than double the material it needs to create a nuclear weapon. Iran has repeatedly threatened to wipe Israel off the map, and Jerusalem views the progress of Iran's atomic program as a direct threat to its existence.
Israel has been working feverishly to acquire enough effective vaccines to inoculate its population against the coronavirus. The Jewish state was one of the first countries to sign a contract to purchase the Moderna vaccine, which has been proven to be 94.5% effective in fighting COVID-19. Dr. Tal Zaks, the Israeli chief medical officer of the U.S. biotech firm, said our vaccine creates antibodies, which means that besides being a preventive vaccine, Moderna can also be used as a treatment for people who have already been infected with corona. He explained that the product prevents the virus from replicating and improves the patient's condition. He added that as one of the first countries to sign with Moderna, Israel will be supplied with the first shipments from the Switzerland production line.
Authorities in Argentina have increased security along its border with Paraguay after receiving credible threats against Jewish targets in the country. The security ministry revealed that it had been informed of a shipment of ammonium nitrate to be used for a bomb with a Jewish objective. Argentina is home to the largest Jewish population in Latin America, which has been targeted by Islamic terrorists on numerous occasions. In 1992, a car bomb detonated outside the Israeli embassy in Buenos Aires killed 9 people and wounded 200. 2 years later, Iranian-backed Hezbollah operatives targeted the Jewish community center in the capital city and perpetrated the deadliest attack in Argentina's history. 85 people were killed and more than 300 were wounded.
8 members of an international peacekeeping force stationed on the Israeli-Egyptian border were killed in a helicopter crash in the Sinai Desert. The 9-member team of U.S.-led multinational force and observers was on a routine mission when the chopper went down. The dead included 6 Americans, along with 1 French and 1 Czech national. 1 American MFO member survived the accident and was evacuated to Soroka Hospital in Beersheba. The MFO was established after the 1979 Egyptian-Israeli peace accords. It draws personnel from 13 countries and covers an area of more than 10,000 square kilometers in the Sinai.
United States Congresswoman Ilhan Omar has called for the U.S. to defund the Jewish state over the recent demolition of several illegal structures. The Democratic lawmaker incorrectly claimed that the unlawful Bedouin encampment belonged to Palestinians, and she falsely accused Israel of ethnic cleansing. The buildings were illegally erected in the Jordan Valley in an area under Israeli security and civilian control. According to a statement, the IDF said it destroyed 7 tents and 8 animal pens, which were unlawfully built in an area declared to be a live fire range.
Israel and Sudan have announced their planned cooperation on several fronts, including water, agriculture, and the fight against coronavirus. Sudan is one of 3 Muslim countries to recently normalize ties with the Jewish state as part of the Abraham Accords brokered by President Trump. Gilad Erdan, Israel's ambassador to the United Nations, announced that peace between the countries has already translated into action by cooperating on these major projects.
Jerusalem excitedly announced the selection of former Israeli Air Force pilot Eitan Steibe to represent the Jewish state on a mission to the International Space Station next year. He will conduct a series of unprecedented experiments that are intended to advance Israeli technologies and scientific developments. Israeli President Reuven Rivlin said, "This is a day of national joy and great pride. An Israeli pilot with a blue and white flag embroidered on his shoulder will prove that even the sky isn't our limit."
Josh Reinstein, the president of the Israel Allies Foundation, has been named among the top 40 global advocates for Israel by the Jewish News Syndicate. The JNS article notes that as head of the Knesset Christian Allies Caucus and the president of the Israel Allies Foundation, Reinstein has revolutionized faith-based diplomacy, harnessing Christian support for Israel with lawmakers in the United States and around the world. Reinstein said he was honored to receive the recognition and to be named among fellow Israel advocates such as Yishai Fleischer, the ambassador to the Holy City of Hebron, Gabriel Groisman, the mayor of Bal Harbour, Florida, and Israeli superstar actress Gal Gadot.
Israeli archaeologists announced the discovery of a 3,000-year-old fortress in the Golan Heights. This ancient structure, which dates to the time of King David, is the oldest fortified settlement to be uncovered in Ramat Golan. Archaeologists attribute the structure to the biblical Geshurites, whose capital was located nearby in Bethesda, near the Sea of Galilee. Geshur was a strong ally of the Kingdom of Israel. In fact, King David married the daughter of the king of Geshur. The book of 2 Samuel notes that their son Absalom took refuge in Geshur with his maternal grandfather, King Ptolemy, for 3 years before returning to Jerusalem. Israel's Construction and Housing Ministry hailed the discovery of the ancient fortress and announced the plans to develop an open-air archaeological park to preserve the national treasure.
We are living in mysterious yet miraculous times. We've witnessed the most remarkable fulfillment of biblical prophecy, the Jewish people's return to Israel, and the prosperity and contributions of this tiny country in such a short time. Yet we've also seen an unexpected rise in anti-Semitism, which takes the form of anti-Zionism and alliances between groups that are fighting against the most fundamental biblical values. In the book Titus, Trump, and the Triumph of Israel, Josh Reinstein answers important questions to clarify what has driven political action from the time that the Roman Emperor Titus destroyed Jerusalem until today, when President Trump recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital. Get your copy today and learn how faith-based diplomacy has changed the world. To order your advance copy, go to triumphofisrael.com.
That concludes the news portion of our show. Stay tuned for Ask the Source with Josh Reinstein.
Hello and welcome to Ask the Source. I'm your host, Josh Reinstein, and we're here in our beautiful studio in Jerusalem. My guest today is Michael Dickson. He is the author of Is Resilience. Michael, thank you for being on the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Josh.
Well, the new book is out. It's a huge success. Tell us a little about it.
So Is Resilience is a study of amazing, resilient Israelis. It's kind of imbued in Israelis' DNA that they can bounce back from tragedy. And we toured the country, north to south, east to west, and met amazing Israelis from different backgrounds, understanding what makes them tough and able to recover after they face some unimaginable horror, terror attacks, war, illness, and how they bounce back, or rather bounce forward. And that we identify as the Is Resilient spirit. And in the book, you're going to learn about the keys to Is Resilience, what makes these amazing people resilient, and how you can be more resilient too. And resilience is something we need in this day and age.
Well, you have the who's who of Israel in the book. Tell us about some of the people that you actually speak to in the book and tell their story.
Yes, we met with Natan Sharansky, who told us how he managed in the Gulag when he was imprisoned by the Soviet regime as a prisoner of Zion. And one of the things he told us is how a sense of humor helped him. He would tell the guards jokes, anti-Soviet jokes, and try and make them laugh. And if he managed to make them smile when they weren't allowed to, it gave him a sense of strength in that solitary confinement. We spoke to Sherry Mandel, the mother of Kobe Mandel, who was murdered by Palestinian terrorists in a horrific terror attack. She talks about bouncing back from bereavement and tragedy and gives us an understanding in how everyone can do that, because we're all going to face it at some point in our lives. We speak to the first Druze member of Knesset and talk about her inspiring story as a woman from a community that doesn't necessarily have the representation from female leaders that it would like, and she talks to us about that. We spoke to spokespeople of the government. We spoke to Ethiopian Israelis who walked barefoot through Africa in order to get to the Promised Land with that promise of Jerusalem inspiring them. So really it was an amazing journey.
You launched this book just now, right in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic. Were there any stories that related to coronavirus, or do these stories actually have some sort of message to people who are suffering from the coronavirus pandemic? Maybe not from health reasons, but maybe financial reasons, or maybe some psychological reasons. How does that work together?
Yeah, we've had amazing feedback to Is Resilience, because people are telling us that in this time, they need to understand how they can be stronger and more resilient and face down these everyday challenges that the COVID-19 pandemic is really impacting on everybody. And actually, on the flip side, one of our interviewees, an amazing Christian Israeli Arab by the name of Yosef Haddad, spoke to us how he was in South Africa in a TV interview, and he was trying to talk about the amazing Israel that he knows. He feels that he appreciates the state of Israel. He's a Zionist, and yet the TV presenter was using COVID-19 against him. They were accusing Israel of not publishing the health guidelines in Arabic as well as Hebrew, and he knew that was a lie, and he called it out on the spot. So actually, these are universal messages that can really be relevant for everybody and anybody.
One of the interesting things is that it's been such a hit with Bible-believing Christians who love Israel. Why do you think Christians are relating to this story?
I think that Christians pray for Israel. I think that Christians support Israel all around the world, but they also appreciate who Israelis are. And they understand what we go through. You know, here in this country, we face dangers all around, and yet we remain true to who we are. We remain true to making sure that our Jewish nation is an amazing country and a vibrant country and a reinvigorated country today. So they see that and they understand that there's something special in the people here, and they're really appreciating the meaning and the stories. One of the people we spoke to is a descendant of people who never left the land of Israel. They were always indigenous. Even when Jews were exiled from the land, she and her family remained. So she's they call her the keeper of the torch. And she really embodies the story of Jewish continuity and of what Israel represents to so many people around the world.
You're also the executive director of Stand With Us Israel. Can you tell us a little about that organization?
Absolutely. Stand With Us is a movement for people who love and believe in Israel and want to learn more, and also counter anti-Semitism around the world. We do two things at once. We push back against lies and misinformation, which we see all too much of when it comes to the state of Israel in the mainstream media and on the campuses and out there in the wide world. And at the same time, we bring people in to the wonder that is Israel, so they can see the true face of Israel and understand the history, the geography, and understand and be armed against that misinformation, and can really represent Israel's position around the world. And we have branches all around the world doing that amazing work.
It's getting pretty scary out there. A lot of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is on the rise, not just in Europe anymore, but also in the United States of America. What is Stand With Us doing to fight anti-Semitism on the streets today?
Absolutely. So we're empowering people to stand up against anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is words and deeds, and we want people to act against both of those things. So we're working with authorities. We have our Center for Combating Anti-Semitism, which advises people how to define anti-Semitism according to the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition, the IHRA definition. So important that we define anti-Semitism in order to be able to fight it. And we give support to students in the grassroots on campuses who are fighting back against one-sided, politicized, anti-Israel divestment from Israel motions on student councils all across North America and all across the world. And we're helping people understand what the truth is through our social media reach, which is huge, and putting information out in multiple languages all over the globe.
I've had the privilege of working personally with Stand With Us here in Israel, and you're one of the most influential and active organizations in the land. How has the coronavirus pandemic affected your work here in Israel?
So coronavirus has affected everyone, and obviously we've been impacted by it as well on a financial level, but we very much have had our amazing supporters really rally around and support our organization because they believe in the work that we do. And at the same time, we've seen some terrible slurs against Israel, people using coronavirus as an excuse to blame Jews and blame Israel for some bizarre reason, which is only linked to their hatred. So we've had to push back against that as well. And let's be clear, anti-Semitism has flourished throughout this whole pandemic era, especially on our campuses. We're seeing people turn to social media and the internet in order to put forward lies and misinformation about Israel. So we're countering that around the clock.
You usually have groups coming and doing symposiums at your center in Jerusalem. Are you changing that format? Are you going Zoom? And if you are, how are people getting involved with that?
Absolutely. So we very quickly pivoted online. Israel was slightly ahead of a lot of the Western world in terms of when the pandemic started. So we quickly pivoted to online, and we're actually reaching more people than ever before. In a normal year, we would have tens of thousands of people come visit us here in beautiful Jerusalem and see our center, which is in King David Street, right in the center of the city. Now we're able to reach people all around the world where we're putting forward educational programs. And if people go to standwithus.com, they can actually sign up for our programs, learn more so they can teach more. We want the people who are educated to become the educators.
I see incredible synergy between your position with Stand With Us and the book Is Resilience. I see how it both comes together. Can you tell us a little about what brings both those messages together?
Absolutely. So we had a really interesting quote. Many people have backed the book, the former chief rabbi of the UK, Jonathan Sacks, and many personalities. And one of them was Senator Joe Lieberman. And he said, Israel is known by so many names. And we know that from the Bible as well. But Israel is known in modern day as, the Holy Land. And Israel is known in our times as the startup nation. And he said, I would love Israelis to be known by their Resilience. And for me, that speaks to the job that we do as well. At the end of the day, we want an even playing field for Israelis in the world. We want people to respect Israel and love Israel, but just to treat us fairly like they do anyone else around the world. And I would love for Israelis to be respected, not just for their amazing ability to turn this desert nation into a startup nation, or for our obviously wonderful history and roots here in the Middle East, but also for that incredible, resilient nature of everyday Israelis. That is resilience.
Michael, there are literally tens of millions of people watching this show. What message do you have for our viewing audience?
So I thank you for your support for Israel. I thank you for praying for Israel, but I also thank you for your action for Israel. And if you want to be active on Israel's behalf, please do join us in countering anti-Semitism and supporting Israel around the world. You can find educational resources to share with your friends and family on standwithus.com. Please join our movement and let's work together to make Israel shine in the nations.
Thank you, Michael, for being on the show. And thank you for tuning in to Ask the Source. I'm your host, Josh Reinstein. Now back to the studio.
Up next, the return to Zion with Karen Hayesod.
Hello and welcome to the Return to Zion with Karen Hayesod. I'm Sam Grundwerg, World Chairman of Karen Hayesod, the leading official fundraising organization for the State of Israel. It was foretold that the children of Israel would return to their land on the wings of eagles. This is why it was so important for Karen Hayesod to support the establishment of Israel's first airline. I hope you enjoy, and God bless you from Jerusalem.
The divine promise of bringing the children of Israel to their land was given to Moses at the foot of Mount Sinai. I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to me, as it is written in the book of Exodus, is a prophecy that has sparked the immigration for 3,000 years. And with the establishment of the Zionist movement and the State of Israel, it has begun to be fulfilled. Eagles made of steel of El Al Airlines have taken to the skies of the Holy Land, carrying with them hundreds of thousands of new immigrants to Israel. They have come from Yemen and Iraq, from North Africa and Ethiopia, from Russia and Ukraine. El Al, Israel's flagship carrier, was established with the support of the donors of Karen Hayesod, a global organization authorized by the Israeli government to raise funds for Israel's most important priority projects. Most urgent is the task of bringing Jews to Israel from countries of distress where they face danger. Just after Israel's establishment, nearly 50,000 Jews were brought to Israel from the ancient Yemenite Jewish community. In 1951 and 1952, more than 130,000 Jews from Iraq were brought home to safety in Israel. El Al Airlines was a key player in these airlifts and in waves of immigration since. Perhaps no one better epitomizes Israel's immigration story than Aryeh Oz. He was accepted into the pilot school of the Israel Air Force and earned his pilot's wings in 1956, and after completing his military service, joined El Al Airlines. He returned to the Air Force in 1991 to fly a jumbo jet taking Ethiopian Jews home to Israel in Operation Solomon.
We were about to evacuate 14,500 Ethiopian Jews from Addis Ababa to Tel Aviv. I flew a 747. We had 760 seats, and I sat on the floor between the seats. We had 1,087 souls on board. I said it's our obligation as the Jewish people to bring everybody to Israel. I felt so happy, that I took part in an operation like this. When we descended and came over Jerusalem, there was not one person in the cockpit who had no tears in his eyes.
For nearly 100 years, Karen Hayesod's vision has turned the dream of the return of the Jewish people to Israel into reality and remains at the center of efforts to sustain and develop a flourishing Jewish homeland in fulfillment of biblical prophecy.
Every time that when I made my walk around in order to see that the aircraft is serviceable, I always looked up and saw the Star of David and said to myself, gee, I'm flying El Al. This is El Al. This is Israel. This is the Jewish people.
Due to the coronavirus pandemic, we're expecting a massive wave of Aliyah from Jewish communities all around the world. Help us bring them home, and let's bless Israel together.
To donate and get information, visit khisrael.org.
Thank you. Secretary of State Pompeo, my dear friend Mike, it's always a pleasure to see you in Jerusalem. Foreign Minister Dr. Azayani, it's a pleasure to see you again, and it's a tremendous pleasure to welcome you for the first time ever in Jerusalem. Undersecretary for International Affairs, Sheikh Al-Khalifa, our dear friend, the U.S. Ambassador to Israel, David Friedman, National Security Advisor of Israel, Meir Ben Shabbat, and my Chief of Staff, Asher Chayun. Just 2 months ago, we made history in Washington. We signed the seminal Abraham Accords. I want to thank President Trump, Secretary Pompeo, and the President's able peace team led by Jared Kushner for their leadership and vision in advancing this historic peace. 3 peace agreements in 6 weeks. I don't think it gets much better than that. Today, we're making history again. This is the first ever official ministerial visit from the Kingdom of Bahrain to the State of Israel. It marks another important milestone on the road to peace between our 2 countries and peace in the region. The peace between Israel and Bahrain is built on solid foundations of mutual appreciation and shared interest. Like Israel, Bahrain respects the past while embracing the future. Like Israel, Bahrain is small in size but big in aspirations. Like Israel, Bahrain has built a thriving economy by fostering innovation and free enterprise. I was going to say, like Israel, Bahrain has natural gas, but I'm not extending this analogy beyond its limits. But Bahrain has natural gas and oil. But it doesn't depend on these resources alone. It has a robust and modern economy with thriving e-commerce and fintech, cutting-edge aluminum production, cutting-edge tourism, and much more. And today, what we're doing in this visit is expanding the much more. Because what we're doing is to enable the free flow of ideas, innovators, entrepreneurs between Israel and Bahrain, both directions. And we are unleashing a tremendously potent economic force and a force for peace, for the benefit of both our peoples.
Lift up your eyes and look around. All your children gather and come to you. The biblical prophecy is unfolding right before our very eyes. The people of Israel are returning to the Promised Land after 2,000 years of exile. But millions of Jews are still longing to come home. Anti-Semitism threatens many of the Jews. We must rescue them before the window of opportunity slams shut. Bless Israel by supporting Keren HaYesod United Israel Appeal, the leading official fundraising organization for the State of Israel. Together, we can fulfill the prophecy of the Bible.
Let's bless Israel together.
To donate and get information, visit our website at www.khisrael.org.
That's all for this edition of Israel Now News. I'm Yochanan El-Rom.
And I'm Rebecca Rand, reporting from our studio in Jerusalem. Please join us again next week for all of your Israel updates.